There are moments in life when the ground beneath your feet seems to crumble without warning. He thought marriage was a bond of trust, a shield against loneliness, a promise that no matter how harsh the world became, they would stand together. But one night, under the glow of dim streetlights, those illusions shattered. She looked at him not as a partner, not as a companion, but as a burden to escape. With a chilling coldness, she whispered words that tore through his soul. "Stop acting like we're married, you don't get a say in where." The story begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where the lawns were neatly trimmed, the houses seemed uniform in their modest beauty, and neighbors waved out of politeness more than familiarity. It was here that Daniel built his life, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. He wasn't wealthy, nor was he a man of grand influence, but he prided himself on being steady, reliable, the kind of person who showed up every day. To him, marriage was sacred. It was the foundation upon which his dreams rested. And for years, he believed his wife, Alina, shared that view. They had met during their university years, two young people navigating uncertain futures with little more than ambition and hope. Daniel was quiet, introspective, and driven by discipline. Alina was his opposite, outgoing, magnetic, the kind of person who walked into a room and commanded attention. He admired her light and often wondered what drew her to him, a man who preferred silence over small talk. Yet she chose him, and in her laughter he found a home. Their wedding was modest but joyful, attended by close family and friends. For Daniel, it was the beginning of a promise he vowed never to break. Life after marriage was simple but fulfilling in its own ways. Daniel worked long hours in finance, a career that demanded consistency, while Alina shifted from one interest to another, chasing passions that never fully bloomed. She dabbled in art, teaching, and even opened a small boutique that Daniel supported financially despite its failure to turn a profit. To him, supporting her was an expression of love, to her, it was freedom to explore. But cracks often appear quietly before they split wide open. Alina began staying out late under the pretense of networking events or catching up with friends. At first, Daniel didn't question her. Trust, after all, was the cornerstone of what they had built. Yet whispers of doubt grew louder in the silence of their home when she didn't answer his calls, or when she returned smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. He buried those suspicions, convincing himself that marriage required patience and understanding, not paranoia. Daniel's parents had taught him to weather storms with dignity, to believe in loyalty, and to stand firm even when tested. But the storm that gathered around his marriage was unlike any he had faced. It wasn't sudden thunder or violent winds, it was a slow erosion, a steady wearing away of the bond he thought was unbreakable. Alina's laughter around him grew scarce. Conversations that once lasted hours dwindled into brief exchanges about bills or errands. Their shared meals became silent rituals, each chewing their food while their minds drifted to other places. The moment that stayed with Daniel most vividly happened one Friday night. He had come home early, surprising Alina with her favorite dinner, hoping to rekindle some warmth between them. But instead of joy, she looked startled, almost irritated. She muttered that she already had plans with friends and left him sitting at the table alone, the candles flickering against untouched plates. That night, he stared at the cold food until it blurred into the shadows, realizing that love, no matter how strong, could not exist in isolation. Friends noticed the change, though he rarely spoke of it. "Marriage has ups and downs," they'd say, brushing off his unspoken fears. Daniel nodded, unwilling to burden others with his private battles. To admit his marriage was crumbling felt like admitting failure, not just as a husband, but as a man. He carried the weight of silence, hoping that if he bore it long enough, things would mend. But Alina was changing. She became sharper in tone, dismissive of his opinions, particularly when it came to decisions about their shared life. Vacations, financial plans, even the smallest choices, she made them without him, as though his presence was optional. Daniel tried to remind her gently that marriage was partnership, but she brushed him off with words that stung. "Don't act like you own me." He wasn't trying to own her, he only wanted to be part of the life they had once vowed to share. There's a kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from lying beside someone who has already left you in spirit. That was Daniel's reality. He'd wake in the middle of the night to find her scrolling through her phone, texting someone she never named. She would smile faintly at the screen, a smile he hadn't seen directed at him in months. He turned away, pretending sleep, swallowing the ache of knowing he was no longer the source of her happiness. Still, he clung to hope. People don't just walk away from years of love, he told himself. Perhaps she was going through a phase, or maybe he had failed to give her the attention she needed. He blamed himself, convinced that if he tried harder, if he gave more, she would return to him. But effort is meaningless when the other heart has already chosen a different rhythm. The pivotal unraveling came one evening after an argument over something trivial, where she planned to spend the weekend. Daniel suggested they visit his parents, something they hadn't done in months. Alina's response was cold, dismissive, and carried a venom that caught him off guard. She said, "Stop acting like we're married, you don't get a say in where." Those words weren't just a rejection of his suggestion. They were a declaration that in her mind, the bond between them no longer existed. For Daniel, it was as if the air had been punched out of his lungs. He stood frozen, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him, heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He realized then that marriage wasn't something she respected anymore. To her, he was an inconvenience, a reminder of promises she no longer valued. To him, those words echoed like a funeral bell, marking the death of trust, the end of the illusion he had clung to. But betrayal has a way of opening wounds deeper than the moment itself. Injustice, he would soon learn, wasn't just about her infidelity or her words, it was about how the world around them responded. When he reached out to family and friends, seeking understanding, many dismissed his pain. Maybe she just needs space, some said. Others hinted that perhaps he was too controlling, too rigid, too old-fashioned. Instead of empathy, he received judgment, as though the unraveling of his marriage was solely his fault. It was then Daniel began to see the cruel reality of betrayal. It isolates you, paints you as the villain in stories you didn't write, and leaves you fighting not just for your dignity, but for the truth of what really happened. He was no longer just battling Alina's rejection, he was battling a narrative that stripped him of his voice. This setup wasn't the full measure of pain, but it laid the foundation. It revealed a man who gave everything, only to be told his everything was worth nothing. It painted the picture of a marriage where love once bloomed but was now suffocated by betrayal and silence. And though Daniel's heart ached with the weight of it, he didn't yet know the storm that was coming, the rising tide of humiliation, injustice, and heartbreak that would push him to his breaking point. After the night Alina told him to stop acting like they were married, Daniel's world shifted into a new and painful reality. It wasn't just the words. It was the venom behind them, the unmistakable truth that she no longer saw him as her partner. That moment became a line in the sand, and everything that followed only deepened his sense of betrayal. Alina grew bolder in her detachment. Where once she had hidden her late nights and vague explanations, now she didn't bother. She left the house dressed in clothes that seemed intended for someone else's eyes, not his. She laughed on the phone openly, whispered in corners without care, and returned home at hours that mocked the sanctity of marriage. It wasn't secrecy anymore, it was defiance. And Daniel, though broken, bore it silently, as if speaking the truth out loud would somehow make it more unbearable. The neighbors noticed. In a community that thrived on appearances, whispers traveled quickly. Daniel saw the looks people gave him, pity from some, smug judgment from others. He overheard fragments of conversations. "Poor man, doesn't he see what's happening? She's out every night, it's obvious." The humiliation gnawed at him more than the loneliness. It wasn't only his wife's betrayal he was enduring, it was the silent trial of public opinion, the quiet ridicule that spread like wildfire. One evening, Daniel followed her. Not because he wanted to trap her or confront her, but because he couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. He drove at a distance as she sped away in her car, heart pounding with every turn of the wheel. She stopped at a sleek downtown bar, a place Daniel rarely visited. From the shadows of his car, he watched her step out, laughing, her hand brushing against another man's arm. The way she looked at him, bright eyes, playful smile, was a look Daniel had not seen directed at himself in years. It was confirmation, a knife twisting deeper into wounds that had barely begun to scar. But Daniel didn't confront her that night. He drove home instead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. He sat in the darkness of their living room for hours, staring at the wedding photo on the mantelpiece. Two young, hopeful faces smiled back at him, unaware of the storm that lay ahead. The injustice wasn't just that she had betrayed him, it was that she had destroyed something sacred, something he had given his life to protect. When she returned later that night, her eyes met his briefly before sliding away. She didn't explain, didn't excuse, didn't even bother lying. She simply walked past him, dropped her purse on the couch, and went upstairs without a word. Silence became their new language, and in that silence, Daniel realized he had been erased. He wasn't a husband anymore. He was a shadow lingering in a house that no longer felt like home. As the weeks passed, Alina's behavior became reckless. She flaunted her independence, throwing her betrayal in his face as though daring him to react. Friends who once shared dinners with them now drifted away, choosing sides without ever asking for his story. To them, Alina was the vibrant one, the social butterfly. Daniel was the quiet, rigid man who probably drove her away. Their sympathy leaned toward her, their judgment toward him. And that was the cruelest betrayal of all, not just her abandonment, but the way the world seemed to strip him of dignity and truth. He wasn't just losing his wife, he was losing the respect of everyone around him. The injustice wasn't confined to his home, it had spilled into the very fabric of his community. Daniel began questioning himself. Was he really the man they thought? Had his devotion been control? Had his silence been weakness? Every doubt gnawed at him, a chorus of voices eroding what little strength he had left. Yet beneath the doubt, a flame of truth still burned. He knew he had loved her. He knew he had given all he could. And he knew the betrayal wasn't his failure, it was hers. But knowing didn't lessen the pain. Every day felt like walking through shards of glass, each step cutting deeper into his resolve. The injustice pressed harder when financial decisions came into play. Alina drained their joint account to fund her outings, leaving him scrambling to cover bills. When he confronted her with quiet words about responsibility, she sneered, saying, "Don't act like you have any control here." Those words echoed the same venom from before, words that stripped him not just of partnership, but of basic respect. There are moments in betrayal when a person breaks loudly, with rage and fury. Daniel broke quietly. He went to work, performed his duties, returned to an empty house, and endured. But inside, his heart was bleeding, his spirit shattering piece by piece. And yet, in that silence, a transformation began. He was no longer the man clinging to illusions of love. He was a man awakening to the brutal reality of injustice. The rising action of Daniel's story wasn't about explosive confrontations or public battles. It was about the slow, suffocating realization that betrayal is not just the act of being left, it is being made invisible, being stripped of your voice, your dignity, and your worth in the eyes of the one person you trusted most. And as that reality pressed harder against him, Daniel's breaking point crept closer, ready to erupt into the climax of his story. The breaking point didn't arrive in a single fiery explosion, it crept in slowly, each wound layering over the last until the weight of it became unbearable. For weeks, Daniel lived in the hollow shell of his marriage, each day a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Alina had stopped pretending altogether. She came and went without explanation, her laughter spilling through the halls and phone calls that weren't meant for him, her perfume lingering long after she left. But betrayal has a way of boiling beneath the surface until it can no longer be contained. Daniel's eruption came on a night that seemed ordinary at first. It was late autumn, the air crisp with the promise of winter. He had returned from work to an empty house, the silence so heavy it pressed against his chest. Hours passed, and when Alina finally walked in, she wasn't alone. Another man stepped in behind her, bold, unashamed, his arm brushing hers like he belonged there. For a moment, Daniel thought his breath would stop. The sight was both surreal and piercingly real. His wife, the woman he had vowed to protect and cherish, stood in their home with another man as if Daniel were invisible. The stranger smirked at him, an expression that cut deeper than words. Alina didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She simply looked at Daniel with cold indifference, as if daring him to acknowledge the truth she no longer cared to hide. The world tilted. Every sacrifice, every moment of loyalty, every dream of forever shattered in that instant. Daniel felt his insides twist, a storm of rage, sorrow, and disbelief tearing through him. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to claw back the dignity that had been stolen from him. But instead, his body betrayed him with silence. His voice caught in his throat, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Alina ushered the man upstairs without a word, her heels clicking against the floor like nails being driven into his heart. Daniel remained frozen, his hands trembling, his vision blurring with tears he refused to shed. That night he sat in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds from above, each one carving another scar into his soul. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was humiliation, degradation, a complete erasure of the man he once was. The breaking point came on a night that started like any other, a night of silence, tension, and unspoken truths. Daniel returned home late from work, his shoulders heavy not just from the weight of his job but from the unrelenting burden of his unraveling marriage. He opened the front door and immediately sensed something was different. Music floated faintly through the hallway, laughter followed, and the unmistakable clinking of glasses reached his ears. Daniel's heart sank. Their home, once a place of comfort and partnership, had become a stage for her betrayal. He walked toward the living room and found her there, Alina, dressed in a shimmering dress, sitting close to the same man he had seen at the bar. The way she leaned into him, the casual intimacy of their gestures, left no room for denial. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was truth laid bare. For a moment, Daniel froze in the doorway, the image burning itself into his memory. His chest tightened, his breath shallow, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The man noticed him first, his smile faltering into awkwardness, but Alina barely flinched. She looked up, her eyes meeting Daniel's, and with chilling indifference, she raised her glass as though toasting her victory. There are betrayals that wound, and there are betrayals that destroy. This was the latter. Daniel's mind screamed, but his voice caught in his throat. He wanted to demand answers, to rage, to ask her why. But she had already made it clear, he no longer had a place in her world. Speaking would change nothing. The man rose awkwardly, muttering something about leaving, but Alina placed a hand on his arm, her touch possessive, dismissive of Daniel's presence. That gesture, so brazen, so unapologetic, was the final fracture. Daniel realized, in that instant, that he wasn't witnessing a mistake or a moment of weakness. He was witnessing a choice. She had chosen this man, this life, this betrayal. And she had chosen it without shame. He turned away, his vision blurring, his chest tight with a mix of rage and grief. Upstairs, he shut the door to their bedroom, a sanctuary that no longer belonged to him. For hours he sat in darkness, replaying every moment of their marriage in his mind. The laughter they once shared, the vows they once spoke, the promises he thought were eternal, all of it seemed like cruel illusions now. He had been a character in a play whose script had been rewritten without his knowledge, his role reduced to that of a fool. The climax wasn't loud. It wasn't a screaming match or a physical fight. It was the suffocating silence of a man realizing he had lost not just his wife, but the story of his life as he knew it. And worse, he realized he had been living in denial far too long. The following days blurred together. Alina didn't apologize, didn't explain. She carried on as though nothing had happened, as though Daniel's pain was irrelevant. She went out more frequently, sometimes not returning until morning. When he confronted her, not with anger, but with a desperate plea for honesty, she laughed. Laughed. The sound of it cut deeper than any words. It was the laughter of someone who no longer cared, who saw his heartbreak as weakness. One evening, after days of torment, Daniel received the final blow. A letter arrived in the mail, not from her, but from a lawyer. Divorce papers. She hadn't even bothered to tell him herself. She wanted freedom, not just from the marriage, but from any trace of his existence in her life. The words on the page blurred as he read them, his hands trembling. She was demanding more than half of their shared assets, even the house he had worked so hard to build. It was more than betrayal now. It was injustice in its rawest form. Not only had she abandoned him, she was trying to strip him of everything he had sacrificed for. The law, indifferent to the truth of his suffering, leaned in her favor. Friends who had once promised loyalty sided with her, painting Daniel as cold, controlling the man who never understood her needs. Lies spread faster than truth, and soon his reputation lay in ruins. The climax of Daniel's story wasn't just the destruction of his marriage, it was the destruction of his identity. He had lived as a husband, a provider, a man of honor. Now he was being reduced to a caricature, a villain in a story he had never written. His dignity was ripped from him, his love mocked, his sacrifices discarded. He began losing himself. Sleep abandoned him, food lost its taste, and the mirror reflected a man hollowed out by grief. At work, he went through the motions, his colleagues whispering behind his back, pitying his downfall. At home, he wandered through empty rooms, each corner haunted by memories of what once was. But amid the devastation, a realization began to bloom. Betrayal had broken him, yes, but it had also revealed a truth he had long avoided. He could not save a marriage that only one person wanted. He had fought for a bond that she had already severed. His pain was real, his injustice undeniable, but he could no longer allow himself to be defined by her choices. The night he signed the divorce papers, his hands shook, tears staining the ink. But as the pen left the page, he felt something unexpected: release. Not peace, not forgiveness, but a release from the chains of a love that had long since turned into cruelty. He walked out of that house, leaving behind the walls that had witnessed his humiliation, the rooms that had echoed with silence. He stepped into the cold night, broken but unburdened, knowing the worst had passed. The climax wasn't triumph. It wasn't justice. It was survival, the raw, painful survival of a man who had lost everything but discovered, in the ashes of betrayal, the first flicker of his own strength. Daniel left the house that night with nothing but a single duffel bag and the weight of 1,000 memories pressing down on his shoulders. He didn't look back as the front door closed behind him. For years, that house had been his sanctuary, his proof that hard work and love could build a life worth living. Now, it stood as nothing more than a monument to betrayal, a place where promises went to die. The first few weeks were the hardest. He rented a small apartment on the edge of town, the walls bare, the rooms cold. At night, he lay awake in a silence that felt different from the silence of his marriage. This one wasn't filled with tension or hidden disdain, it was emptier, lonelier, but oddly pure. He was no longer fighting to hold together a bond that didn't exist. He was simply surviving, breath by breath, day by day. The world, however, was not kind. Whispers followed him at work, sideways glances carried unspoken judgments. Some colleagues avoided him altogether, unsure of what to say, while others offered hollow platitudes that only deepened his isolation. Friends he had known for years had already chosen their side. They invited Alina to gatherings, praised her bravery for starting over, and quietly erased Daniel from their lives. Betrayal wasn't confined to one person anymore. It had spread like poison, seeping into every corner of his existence. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Daniel began to rebuild. He threw himself into long runs at dawn, pounding the pavement as though he could outrun the ghosts of his past. He started journaling, scribbling down the raw ache of his days, the confusion, the anger, the faint flickers of hope. Therapy followed, a step he had resisted at first, but one that became a lifeline. In that safe space, he found words for the pain he had bottled up for so long. For the first time, someone listened without judgment, without dismissing his suffering as weakness. Through that process, he began to understand something profound. Betrayal doesn't just shatter relationships, it shatters the person who has been betrayed. It forces you to question everything, your worth, your choices, your very identity. But it also offers, hidden beneath the wreckage, a chance to rebuild on stronger foundations. Alina's absence became less of a wound and more of a scar, one he would carry but no longer bleed from. The photos that once haunted him found their way into a box tucked deep into a closet, out of sight but never fully erased. He learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, it meant learning to live with the memory without letting it define him. Months turned into a year, and Daniel grew in ways he never imagined possible. He reconnected with his parents, who had watched helplessly as their son suffered in silence. He rekindled old hobbies, painting and music, passions long buried beneath the weight of work and a crumbling marriage. He even began volunteering at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others who carried their own invisible battles. Still, injustice lingered. Alina thrived in the eyes of society. She posted photos of vacations with her new partner, smiling as though the vows she once made had never existed. People applauded her for finding happiness, blind to the devastation she left in her wake. For Daniel, it was a bitter truth that the world often celebrates those who betray while silencing those who are betrayed. But with time, he stopped seeking justice from others. He realized that vindication would never come from the world, it had to come from within. His healing was not about proving her wrong, but about proving to himself that he could rise again. The turning point came during one of his evening runs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel stopped, breathless, on a hill overlooking the city. For the first time, he felt the weight of the past loosen its grip. He wasn't just a man betrayed, a husband abandoned, a story twisted by lies. He was a survivor, a man who had endured the unendurable and still found the strength to keep moving forward. The scars remained, yes. Trust would be harder to give, love harder to believe in. But scars are not signs of weakness, they are reminders of survival. And Daniel had survived. As he stood there, watching the city lights flicker to life, he realized his story wasn't ending, it was only beginning. The betrayal that once threatened to destroy him had forged in him a resilience he never knew he possessed. He wasn't defined by what she did to him, he was defined by how he chose to rise from it. And so, he walked back down that hill, each step lighter than the last, carrying with him not the weight of betrayal but the quiet strength of a man who had faced the darkest of nights and still chosen to see the dawn. Because in the end, betrayal may break your heart, it may shatter your illusions, but it cannot erase your will to survive. And perhaps that is the cruelest justice of all, that those who betray may move on quickly, but those who endure betrayal carry a strength that no one can take away. So the question remains, when the person you trusted most destroys the very foundation of your life, do you let the ruins bury you? Or do you build something stronger from the ashes?